the race in this state and nationally. Don't know that's the case. I think they're primed to participate, as Professor Rose stated. I think that will be the case, but I worry in the back of my mind about an exhaustion effect and folks just checking out.
May I add something? So I agree. I just want to emphasize that I feel like so a lot of my work on campus is in relation to young people in politics. And we have so many rich conversations where the students express frustration with the fact that they do show up, like when they do show up to vote, oftentimes they don't see policy outcomes that address the challenges that are really important to them. So Professor Haynie is absolutely right. So I just want to echo that. And I think one of the factors that will be really crucial in determining whether that exhaustion effect sort of carries the day is whether the candidates who are on the ballot inspire young people to turn out. So if they see kind of the same old, rhetoric from the same old candidates, I don't know that will bode well for young people turnout.
Absolutely. Thank you both. And you've made me almost redundant here. You can just carry on the conversation. I don't need to be in the room. It's great. So I want to come back to one of the obvious issues, Professor Haynie, that you brought up, and I'd like both of your perspectives on, as it pertains to some of the things you've just talked about, young voter turnout and exhaustion. We have the kind of presidential race that on one hand is kind of been unusual in recent decades and also unprecedented. You have concerns about an aging president running for a second term and a likely opposition frontrunner who's facing multiple criminal indictments. Obviously, this is uncharted territory, especially on the latter side. But Professor Haynie starts off, I know it's impossible to say how this will play out, but what do you think are going to be some of the key things here? Are there, given the scheduling of some of the kind of legal cases against former President Donald Trump, could that actually affect his eligibility to be on the ballot? Does it galvanize people who support him and feel like he's being targeted? What do you see as some of the key issues in the presidential race over the next year?
Well, I think the first issue you raised in this context, age, would be a big factor. I think voters we see in some of the polls, and I don't pay too much attention to polls right now, but the polls are showing, I think this is something in the polls that I think is serious, is that is a concern about the age of both candidates, and more so with President Biden, who will be in his mid-80s if elected, and starts a second term. I think that's a real issue. However, that issue may be outweighed and overcome on the other side by the legal issues related to the former president, former President Trump, if he is the nominee, and we presume that he will be the nominee, notwithstanding the indictments. So I think the trial schedule will be a big factor that may make age on the other side less of an issue, if it really is one to begin with. I think the criminal charges will be interesting as these cases unfold and evidence comes out in a criminal proceeding. I think you'll see a change in public opinion. The former president is doing well, seems to be doing well in early polling in Republican primary states. Seems to be the front runner in that race and the presumptive nominee, we can say. But as information comes out through trials and evidence, we may see some dramatic shifts in the support for the former president within his own party, and certainly among independent leaning voters who may not be willing to hop on that train again.
Sorry, I muted myself there for a second. Thank you very much for that, Professor Haynie. Professor Rose, your perspective on that. In previous decades, even the hint of criminal charges against a candidate would just disqualify them from anybody supporting them. And yet, obviously, what we've seen over the last decade is a kind of inversion of that, where it seems like the more President Trump comes under legal scrutiny, the more entrenched some elements of his support become. Do you have any perspective on how your research suggests that might play out over the next year, or the particular issues involved there?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think one of the major factors that has shaped elections historically has been just the legitimacy of the candidates and just sort of the integrity of the process. And to my mind, the fact that we're even having this conversation reflects just how much has changed politically and what a unique political landscape we're operating in when there are certain features of a candidate that are not disqualifying. that actually might serve to energize a base. And so I think, some of this, to my mind, it really speaks to the polarization that we see in the political landscape, and the fact that lawmakers increasingly have an incentive to actually, to sort of vocally push back against the establishment and to frame themselves as, sort of outside of the box, or outside of the sort of norms of politics. I think that's actually a very interesting, relatively new feature of our political landscape. I don't think it's something that's going to go away anytime soon.
Let me add too, I think there's a potential here, right, for the race to be shaped in a particular way. I mean, on the Democratic side, they can go out and make the argument and make the case. So you want this chaos, these trials and all the things leading up to the trials and surrounding the trials will be chaotic. And I think the country is certainly tired, as we talked about earlier, right, all that is going on in the political arena. And so Sleepy Joe, if you will, can make the case that, hey, I look pretty good. In opposition to this chaos of a trial and this chaotic past presidency of Donald Trump. And do you want that again, or do you want me, Sleepy Joe? Chaos versus competence and steadiness can be a way this race shapes up.
Absolutely. Thank you both. And Professor Haynie, I'd like to stay with you for a moment. You study demographics, particularly here in the South. And much like for Professor Rose, it's always been said that when young voters turn out, they will change election. We've heard through many cycles that the changing demographics here in the US, racially and across other dimensions, will ultimately start to influence the results of elections. What kind of things do you expect based on your observation of demographic changes, ongoing demographic changes across the South? Do you think we could start to see impacts on election results? And what would that look like? Because some people assume that a demographic change means an obvious shift towards the left if it's a racial change. But what do you think we should expect?
We'll certainly see. I mean, we saw in the last election, if you go back to 2020 and just go to Georgia, right, and you see what happened in the state of Georgia with the Democrats won that state at the presidential level and some Senate races in the state of Georgia. That in part, and to a large part, was due to a demographic shift in the state of Georgia, but not just changing demographics. That's an important factor, but more important is if you can turn the voters out. And sort of a very effective turnout campaign in Georgia. So demographics are important, but demographics are not destiny. You have to work to get your voters out to the polls. So there's some advantages for the Democrats in the change in demographics in the South and places like Georgia and our own state of North Carolina. Even with the influx of new people coming to this state, and just sort of every time you turn around, you see growth in the major metropolitan areas in North Carolina, and that may bode well for the Democrats. Even the Republicans who tend to come to this state or coming to this state are not the so-called elite Trump Republicans, but more so the old, we used to call the Rockefeller moderate liberal Republicans, and that may favor Democrats in elections going forward. But the key is taking those changing demographics and putting that into action by turning out your voters on election day.
Absolutely. Thank you, Professor Haynie. Professor Rose, I'd like to come back to you. You mentioned the kind of issues that tend to drive younger voters. There's been so much discussion of abortion restrictions over the last couple of years. Obviously, the 2022 election, a midterm election, is not necessarily the best predictor of what presidential turnout might be. It's much lower. Do you expect both sides in the election next year to use that as a key issue? And do you think that it will be a big driver of turnout next year?
I actually do. And I suspect that we've seen some, like in our most recent electoral bouts, we saw that abortion rights, reproductive rights really did loom large in bringing some people out to the polls. So according to Pew, we know that 62% of all Americans believe that abortion should be legal in all or most cases. Among younger voters, people between 18 and 44, that's even a little higher at 68%. I think this presents an especially interesting issue for both parties, I think especially for the Republican Party, because there's a generational divide when it comes to reproductive rights. Among young Republicans between 18 and 44, the Pew organization reports that 47% of them believe that abortion should be legal in all or most cases. That's compared to a more modest 34% for Republicans over the age of 45. And so, I think we saw this in the Republican primary debate when candidates, got that question, and it's a really clear it's really clear that there are some mismatches between the candidates' positions on reproductive rights and where younger people are. I think that's also the case for climate change. So again, two of those top issues for young Republicans. And I think for the candidates, just figuring out how to connect with young Republicans and to attract young Republican support or support for Republican candidates among the young is going to be an interesting task when they're trying to work with a base that has, such different views on the issue.
Greg, let me point out here, something that we saw in the past few days on this issue. Former President Trump has seen trying to pivot when it comes to reproductive rights and abortion, right? He was hardline and bragged and boasted about his Supreme Court appointments that helped shape and change the precedent on this issue. But now trying to pivot, I think in response to what Deondra just pointed out, right? Trying to pivot, understanding that the public may not be where his party is on this issue. And wanting a more progressive stance on reproductive rights than where the Republican Party has placed itself over the last several years.
Absolutely, thank you. And Professor Haynie, I'd like to follow up with you on that because, in past elections, we know that reproductive rights or bids to ban abortion on the right have been a driver of getting people out to the polls. And, progressives have always warned people that their reproductive rights are under threat if they don't. Now we have a very different picture. Do you think that a kind of a desire to restore reproductive rights could drive Democrats to the polls? And is it possible that on the Republican side, because now some people may feel the job is done with the restrictive abortion bans that are in place, that it maybe won't be as successful getting people out to the polls on that side of the issue as it has been in the past? Or is that an oversimplification, do you think?
I think it's going to be a driver in turning out both Democratic and Republican voters. So I think most Republican voters think the Republican Party has gone too far. If you look at different states, right, in the various states, there have been some really restrictive, going beyond where we are nationally, I think, in individual states. And I think that's going to drive folks to the poll, even Republicans who think we've gone too far or their state has gone too far with regards to restricting reproductive rights and access to abortion. And so I think it's going to certainly be a driver in turnout for the Democrats, but it may shift some Republican voters to Democratic candidates on this issue.
And before we move on, specifically here in North Carolina, obviously Trump won the state in 2020 by a very, very narrow margin. And this is a state that in some ways is seen as purple, even though it's moved kind of to the right considerably in its state legislature over recent years. Do you think that this will be a crucial issue here in this state? And if not, what do you think will be the bigger national issues that might kind of particularly drive turnout or drive conversation in North Carolina?
I think the abortion issue will loom large. And in part, one of the things about this state, we have quite a few young voters, the colleges and universities in North Carolina. We have quite a few, and there'll be some activity, I suspect, on the campuses around this issue of reproductive rights and healthcare and the climate issue as well. I mean, we are on the coast, and these storms that seem to be more powerful and more frequent affects us in North Carolina. And I think that issue will also be a driver in turnout in the election, but certainly abortion, the climate, and even voting rights. This is something where we thought we had put to rest access to the ballot. And we've seen in some states, including our own here in North Carolina, efforts to restrict the rights of folks to vote, to make it harder to vote. And that would be a driver, I think, in turning out voters in the election cycle that's upcoming. Folks will react to that. It may motivate folks who thought, again, that right was secured and now we see it under threat again, may be motivated to turn out in opposition to where the state is going.
Absolutely. Thank you. Because this conversation has been motoring along. So if you are with us on Zoom and you would like to ask a question, you can pose it in the Q&A window at any time, or you can raise your hand if you would like to ask a question in person, and we'll unmute you when your turn comes around. Professor Rose, I'd like to come back to you. Professor Haynie was just mentioning about the restrictions on voting here in North Carolina and elsewhere, and we're looking at some more restrictions coming in, this fall for municipal elections. Can you talk a little bit about what voting access in North Carolina looks like right now, and what effect, like whether you think that may in fact depress turnout, given that it might make things more difficult to vote, or could it just be a spur for more people to come out because they feel like that right is under attack?
That's the $1,000,000 question, right? And I would say that in North Carolina is absolutely, we've got, it's a hot topic in our state, a hot issue, but we're not alone. So it's interesting. I've recently been reading through some interesting analysis from the nonpartisan group, the Voting Rights Lab, and they suggest that, there have been, I want to say nearly 20 states, at least 20 states that have enacted voting rights or voting related, election related legislation since 2020. So in anticipation of 2024, we've seen state legislatures really working to either expand access to the ballot or to restrict it. And so interestingly, the Voting Rights Lab, they actually say that about a third of the policies coming out of state legislatures actually expand voting rights. So we're seeing some expansions of early voting, of mail-in voter access, of voter opportunity, things like that. But in many other states, we're seeing some restrictions made. So efforts to, hold poll workers criminally liable if they make mistakes. Restricting access to early voting, restricting access to mail-in balloting. In some states, there are questions about whether college students should be permitted to vote where they're enrolled in schools. And so I think these are some of the issues that we're absolutely dealing with in North Carolina. And on one hand, there seems to be among activists, and young activists in particular, there's a lot of attention being paid to this, and there is active work. But the question is, as the changes are taking place and working to suppress votes, can that activism counteract what we're seeing? We know, like from the research, that young people are afraid to make mistakes. So one of the most powerful ways to suppress youth vote turnout and vote turnout in general is to make things complicated, add so many complexities that people have more questions than answers, and then they decide to sit it out and say, you know what, I don't want to be in trouble with the law, so I'm just going to sit this one out and watch from the sidelines. And to my mind, that's one of the most troubling effects of this particular type of legislation, in addition to the democratic implications.
Absolutely. Thank you. Professor Haynie, I wanted to come back to you on this general topic. There's a story this week about the state legislature in North Carolina wanted to restructure boards of elections, in this state, which have historically always been divided 3-2 in favor of the party of the governor. And now, the legislature wants to take appointment power to those boards. Can you talk a little bit about that, what it actually means and why it's significant?
Again, they should be careful what they wish for, because the current status, right, where you have a Democratic government won't always be the case. But it's an effort to overcome a perceived advantage that the party of the governor has in state board of elections. But it's interesting in the sense that these state board of elections historically have been, they played it straight, and it's not a partisan position, even though they are partisans. They tend to have called it as they saw it and held and oversaw elections in a fair and honest way. I think coming out of the 2020 national election and questions about election integrity, these boards of election have garnered more attention, and folks believe that there was some unfair and untoward activities around elections having to do with decisions that boards of elections have made. So this has become a much more political issue, where we didn't really pay much attention to boards of election before 2020. They just went about doing their work as citizens who want to serve their state and their parties. But they've done it in a sort of bipartisan way in the manner in which they proceeded heretofore. But now I worry about these efforts to put a spotlight on these boards of election in a very partisan way. So we should watch this as this progresses, not only in North Carolina, but in other states as well.
Absolutely. Thank you both very much. Professor Rose, I wanted to come back to you. We've talked a lot about young voters, but what we are seeing is some younger candidates coming through. But of course, the fact that, we've got two of the oldest men ever running for the presidency, I think is also symptomatic of what we see across the country. We tend to see candidates being older because they're better resourced, and because of some of the financial turmoil we've had over the last 10 years, it's harder for younger people maybe to have the resources to enter politics. Do you expect to see more younger candidates on the ballot next year to kind of counteract that? Or do you think that those economic forces that have prevented maybe more young people being on the ballot will continue? Any thoughts on that?
That's a great question. It's true. Running for office, it's challenging for anyone. And that's why we do tend to see people, in many cases, we see certain professions overrepresented in elected office. So, oftentimes people who are lawyers, for example, have more latitude to run because they have more control over their work schedules, and they can maybe take time to serve on a state legislature out of their practice. That's something that many people, particularly young people, may not have the sort of latitude to do and the means to do. And so it's interesting that young people are paying attention to this. I recently saw news coverage of a PAC that David Hogg, who's one of he's an activist down in Florida who's done a lot of work over the years on gun violence. And he's established a new PAC that supports candidates under the age of 35. And to my mind, we'll see more efforts like this. As he frames his operation, he and his team, they say, look, if you're interested in running for office, we will help you do it. We will help you raise money. We will help you connect with supporters. We'll show you how to campaign. We'll give you the kind of support that you need to do this. I think that's something that's been missing in the political landscape. And it's interesting to note that there are quite a few organizations that offer candidate training, and some that recruit candidates. And historically, parties have been in this role of recruiting candidates. And in many cases, young people are not really prioritized as the candidates who are recruited. So to my mind, given their significance for the political landscape, and I think, again, the sense among a lot of young people that what's going on now, the status quo of the contemporary political landscape, is not sustainable, and it's not something that they feel a lot of inspiration from or hope in, that it's time to roll up their sleeves and jump in the game.
Let me, if I can comment on this issue. One of the things I think that's keeping younger folks and others from jumping into politics is the development that we've seen in recent years, and that is that politicians are under threat. And I mean that in a multitude of ways, and including personal threat. The number of elected officials now who have security details has gone up. And why would anybody want that, right? Even if you're willing to serve, you want to serve, why would you want to take that on? The legal challenges or the threats of impeachment and other kinds of investigations, why would you want to subject yourself or your family members to this? And the financial burden that comes along with these challenges is something that may be keeping folks away from entering politics. And so we need to figure out a way to get the toxicity and the animus out of the political arena and tone it down for the health of our democracy, or we won't find new candidates entering into the arena and wanting to serve, because who would want to put themselves through what we see going on now?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. I want to pivot for a second, and I'll stay with you, Professor Haynie, first on this. In recent presidential cycles, certainly the last two, polling, we might predict one thing and then something else happens. And it seems like we go through these cycles where, polling predict everything, and then polling is dead. Polling is over. We don't listen to polls anymore. What is the kind of state or condition of polling right now? Because obviously AI and so many more technological tools available to us. How much of a role do you think polling is going to play through 2024? Because of course, in the past, we've actually seen polls actually drive results, arguably, and drive things. So how much will polls be in play next year, do you think?
They'll be in play quite a bit, and for good or bad, polls are with us, and they will be a factor in the election cycle. But one thing about polling now, there's very little correlation between what you see in polls at this stage of a presidential race and what actually happens come next November. So I pay very little attention to most of what's going on in these polls today. As we move closer to the election cycle, as the primaries get underway, and as we move into next summer, the polls will begin to reflect, I think, more accurately voter sentiment and directions of the electorate than they do now. We're just too far away for the polls to make any sense. This crazy one about Joe Biden being too old. So what does that mean? If I'm a Democrat and I think he's too old, that I'm not going to vote for him, that's the question I want to know. Well, will I vote for him nonetheless? If he's the candidate and the other candidate is Donald Trump. It's not whether I think he's too old. I may think he's too old, but I'm still going to vote for him. So the polls are just kind of wonky at this stage. But I think as they get closer to the election, I start to pay more attention to what the polls have to say.
Absolutely. Thank you. Professor Rose, anything to add on that? What do you think will be the crucial polling issues or things to look at with polls over the next year?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I spend a lot of time thinking about related to polls is just their reliability and questions about how effectively they connect with communities that are hard to reach. So particularly young people, in the old days of polling, a lot of it was done by telephone. And when people started getting cell phones, sometimes it became really difficult to connect with them. Now I think, like you say, with AI, there's capacity for more sophistication in polling operations. But I think just making sure that the polls are keeping up with the needs to connect with the constituencies that they need to connect with is sort of a top issue here.
Absolutely. Thank you both. Professor Haynie, I want to bounce back to you here again for a second. What do you think are some of the key races, especially at the state level, that you will be keeping an eye on that you think might be kind of indicative of maybe larger trends elsewhere? I know we've got a fascinating gubernatorial race, it looks like, shaping up in this state.
That's the one I'm going to watch closely, right? Because we won't have an incumbent running. And we'll have two fresh candidates from the Democratic side and the Republican side, yet to be determined. I think on the Democratic side, the lieutenant governor, the Republican lieutenant governor, may be the front runner on the Republican side, and the attorney general, the Democratic candidate, may be the front runner, but they have challengers. But this race I'm going to watch because we have two newcomers, so to speak, that we won't have an incumbent in the governor's seat running. And it'd be a good to watch that competition as a bellwether for what happens in the rest of the election cycle in North Carolina up and down the ticket. Having said that, I think the gubernatorial race in North Carolina is going to be driven and pulled by what's happening nationally. I think that the national election will dominate and shape statewide races, including this one. In this state, this governor's race in North Carolina, I just think the national election is looming large this time around, and will drive dynamics in the state races.
Absolutely. Thank you. Professor Rose, any things in particular that you will be watching for, or races you'll be watching?
Absolutely. So I would echo that. This North Carolina's gubernatorial race is top of viewing and listening for me on all platforms. I think that it's interesting to hear the candidates' platforms and the statements that they're making, I think, are especially indicative of how their parties are positioning themselves in the state, and have really important implications for thinking about what it takes to win statewide in North Carolina. I would also say, though, in advance of 2024, I'm really curious about municipal elections that are coming up just this year. So, there are a number of mayoral races that are happening this coming November. And I think one of the things I'm noticing among young people in particular is interest in local, municipal politics, municipal elections. So recognizing, I think oftentimes it's easy to place a lot of attention at the federal level, perhaps within education settings, in teaching public policy, but students are increasingly aware of and savvy about the significance of local politics, and they're paying a lot of attention to those races. So city council races, mayoral races, county commission, and so on. I think those are also important contests to watch.
Absolutely, thank you. And Professor Haynie, what about that? We've got, as Professor Rose mentioned, this slate of local elections here coming up this fall. I know there's always a danger in kind of looking too deeply into the crystal ball, but do you think there's anything we might be able to extrapolate once we're on the other side of those, to kind of in terms of taking the temperature of where people are politically heading into a presidential year?
There may be some analysis, post-election analysis that the local election context may be able to provide us with some information. And one is that, state legislatures have become extremely important in policy statewide and nationally, right? So if you look at state legislatures now, where the action is on abortion, on voting rights, crime and justice issues that the public seems to be very salient among the public. So what happens at the state level may be informative for shaping national level politics going forward. So it does does require us to pay some attention to these local races, particularly state legislative races in the states, as we think forward about national politics into the 2026 midterm elections and beyond.
Absolutely. Thank you. Professor Rose, I'll come back to you. I'd like both of your perspectives on this. America can often be rather insular country and looking very inward. Do you think that global issues are going to play a really, really big role, next year? I mean, unlike in past presidential cycles, the US no longer has a presence in Afghanistan and Iraq, but there's a situation in Ukraine, there are tensions with China. Do you think that we're looking at an election cycle that's mostly focused inward to the US, or will there be a lot of global issues in play, do you think?
That's a great question. I think that's something I'm going to remain open to seeing unfold. To my mind, I think there has been quite a bit of interest when it comes to Ukraine. I think it's something that's played into, and very importantly, some of the ratings of President Biden's job performance. And so I think that's something that, in terms of at the federal level, thinking about presidential candidates, people will absolutely be paying attention to. It's not just how they're likely to fare or have their records in terms of how they have fared in terms of domestic issues, but also, what are their records in terms of international affairs and global issues. But I actually do sense that domestic issues are especially hot right now in the political landscape. So I'm very interested to see whether we might see a shift in that balance between the domestic and the global. But as of now, it feels like things feel heavily domestic, but I mean, absolutely things could change.
So, Professor Haynie, how about that? I mean, on the presidential race in particular, the Russia's invasion of Ukraine didn't occur until after Biden was president. But of course, the first impeachment of Donald Trump resulted from, alleged communications around the Ukraine issue. Do you think that that's something that either candidate will seek to highlight as an issue if those two end up being the presidential candidates?
I think so. I think there's a potential for that to happen, especially on the part of President Biden. I agree with Professor Rose. I think national issues are going to dominate the election cycle. But I think the Democrats have an advantage, and President Biden has an advantage if he can shape and make international and global issues part of the race. And again, the argument would be competence versus chaos. One of the things that's happened over the last, 3.5 years is that we become more stable internationally, right? Our foreign policy is a much more traditional foreign policy. It's not the chaos of the previous administrations, but the argument could be on the side of the Democrats. And I suspect they will make that part of their case to the American public, this issue of just general competence, including in international affairs, that our status has gone up. We are active again in leading in international affairs. And I think that may be an important issue for the Democrats to raise.
Absolutely. Thanks to you both. We're going to wrap up here shortly, but before we do, I'd like to give each of you an opportunity to talk about this because it's important. We've talked about the things that can keep people away from the polls and jadedness and concern about, falling afoul of the law. But I wonder if each of you, starting with you, Professor Rose, could talk about, even though it might sound obvious, the importance of participation and how who shows up can kind of drive the policy agenda. Why is it so important to actually play an active part in the political process?
Oh, yeah. I love this question. To my mind, and we see this play out in research, people who do participate, people who engage, that participation translates into policy outcomes. Lawmakers pay attention to those who show up. And we've seen this in the past. In years when certain demographics that have historically been underrepresented have been substantial parts of a winning coalition, they've been rewarded with policy policies that have targeted the issues near and dear to their hearts pretty soon. I mean, I'm thinking a lot about when Barack Obama was elected, and there was this very, very substantial turnout and participation among young Americans. And then we saw very soon in that administration policies that were intended to address issues like the student loan burden, providing access to college, and other issues near and dear to young voters' hearts. So I think, one, in terms of having policy outcomes that do address the needs and the sort of frustrations of each constituency, turning out is important. More broadly, just in terms of democracy, we are a democratic system of government that turns on active participation among the entire population. And so, we've never actually had complete participation for so many reasons. And so when we think about, whether we're doing this system of government properly or effectively, a question of how many people have the means and the inclination to show up to vote is a crucial one. So to my mind, for that sort of tangible, sort of interest in policy outcomes reason is number one, but also just in terms of maintaining our democratic system of government as an important number two.
Yeah, I agree completely with Professor Rose on this, that there are some self-interested reasons to participate in the system, because again, politicians know who vote. If no one else knows, good politicians know who has participated and who's likely to participate. So when voters turn out, they do get a response to get the attention of politicians and elected officials, and that's important. But I think her last point, I think, is extremely important going forward. The health of American democracy is under siege. There's some challenges to our institutions. And I think it's incumbent upon voters to get out and participate in multiple ways, not only in voting, in other ways as well. Because again, it's one of the things that is this moment, this last several years in American politics, has been a challenging one, and a frightening one in many respects. But as someone who teaches students, I mean, it's been good for me to have this to point to, right? To see that democracy is not a given. There's no guarantee that our institutions will hold. It depends on folks of goodwill, folks of good character, folks with good intentions to be holding office and also holding those who hold office accountable. So participating is extremely important. And I think if you don't understand that in this time that we're in, that we really are in trouble.
Absolutely. Thank you, Professor Haynie, and thank you both. I think there's a perfect place at which to end. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thanks to our panelists, Kerry, Haynie, and Deondra Rose, for sharing your expertise and your opinions with us today. If you'd like to be notified about upcoming briefings, please email dukenews@duke.edu, or if you're watching on YouTube, just like and subscribe. Thank you very much for joining us. Have a great day, and make sure you register to vote. Thanks very much.